You guys, it happened. I'm kidding. It's the PYRESWAP show. Welcome to the PYRESWAP show. Let me bring my whiteboard on board. Today's Tuesday, and I want to thank you guys for making it through that long dark night when we had to cancel the show yesterday on Monday. I know that was perhaps traumatic for a lot of you, but I want you guys to know that life isn't all sunshine and rainbows, and you're gonna have little upsets like that. I want to actually talk about the price action as you see it now, and I want to talk about the price action that you guys probably saw between Friday and Saturday. Did you guys see that red candle sled, that little upset of red candles between Friday and Saturday? Did you guys see that? Okay, so Javery, if you're not aware, what that was is that was actually that was a marketing payment that was overdue from June, and somebody, a YouTuber, needed the money because they were tight. Does that make sense? They're going to try to buy back in, but they needed the money, they were tight. And basically, my original agreement was that they could liquidate around this time anyway, right? August 15th. So how on earth could I tell them not to? But I want to be clear, we also reduced emissions. We reduced emissions again. Let me draw these numbers up again. 3% to 1.75%. This is the expansion right now. Now, when this happens, APR, as it's seen in the farms, gets reduced. Does that make sense? So what looks like it's a 1,000% yearly now looks like a 600% yearly. What looks like a 600% yearly now looks like a 400% yearly. It's a sharp reduction in APR, and there is always the possibility that some people are just holding this token in liquidity because of APR. Does that make sense? Because of the farm emissions. And if we cut these emissions, which we do, there's always the chance that some of them will withdraw their liquidity, which may or may not be deep, and they will then just dump the entire bag. And what you'll end up seeing is possibly upsets like you saw on Friday and Saturday. Does that make sense? But the good news here is that that then becomes as bad as it can get. You get what I'm saying? So we have to take a risk when we do this every single time, because we're going to do it one more time. We're going to go from 1.75 to 1.0%. It's our goal to stop here. There is, if we need to, for some sort of emergency reason, we could go below 0.1. Sorry, we could go below 1. We could go to 0.5, 0.7, something like that, 0.3, whatever the fuck you want. But I want to stop it here. I want to stop it here because I think that this is an expansion rate that is good enough to still incentivize people deploying liquidity, but it'll also allow for deflation to keep up with inflation. And again, when we talk about deflation and inflation, we're not talking about just expansion and contraction, okay? Because the thing about inflation and deflation, and this is something that's not really understood in modern finance versus decentralized finance, sometimes things are referred to as inflationary when they mean that the supply is expansionary. Does that make sense? So it's not just, it's this. It's quantity going up and it's price going down. And this is like an and or. Does that make sense? Deflation, quantity going down, price going up. And this is an and or. Does that make sense? The and or, I think, is the part that always screws people up because this is a multivariable equation. So, Javery, you're a guy with an engineering background. Do you know the formula for watts in electrical engineering? Javery, we could discuss that. It is too early, though. Yeah, it is way too early. As far as all the incentives on the roadmap, there are things like leaderboards, there are farms, there is, on top of the fact that the night game will be entirely based around LP management, there will also be the Professor Phi's liquidity dashboard, which will help people understand what the actual background incentives there are to deploying LP without emissions. So there's four things. Okay. Leaderboards, titles, dashboards, farms, and then arguably the night game, which is just total supply management. which also incentivizes liquidity deployment. I guess that's 5 things. Javery, in phase 2, for those of you who don't know, there's a token called PYRE, just P-Y-R-E, all caps. Does that make sense? PYRE does not track anything. It is not. The only thing it tracks is its own TWAP over time. It doesn't track like another gas token or anything like that. PYRE is emitted in farms. Yes. Pega, that's correct. And I think in order to explain that, there still probably required like a dashboard for it. But yes, there's 5 things. Not all those 5 things will be built at the exact same time, but there is actual incentives for LPing beyond Genesis for sure. In phase 2, we'll definitely have farms and you'll have a dashboard, which are pretty good. The night game in phase 2, the farms and the dashboard. I don't know if we'll have like the title system for liquidity. I'm not gonna explain that right now. Talking about future stuff. I think I would rather. I appreciate the bullishness because if you guys are asking about phase 2 stuff, I appreciate that you're bullish. I think that what's better for me to discuss right now is to talk about things in the present because I think a lot of people right now are uneasy or uncertain. So I can explain things that might help them be less uneasy or less uncertain. Okay, Jerry, PYRE is a chaos token. It exists exactly that, ZeroKex. It exists entirely for liquidity incentives, and its supply, expansion, and contraction mechanisms are based around. Holy shit! Yeah. Its supply, expansion, and contraction mechanisms, Javery, are based on 2 systems known as lunary and augury. And lunary means phases of the moon, and augury means observed bird behavior. So back in the day, Javery, are you guys aware this is a fantasy fiction project? Who here is aware this has a fantasy fiction theme? Okay, so Javery, the words I'm using here. By the way, we have colored erasers now. So we have an eraser for Phantom, we have an eraser for Avalanche, and we have an eraser for BNB. Do you guys see that? We did that just for you guys. We thought it would enrich the show. Yeah. Anyways, I'll use the Phantom ones, and that's what everyone's thinking about. Okay, I will first explain multivariable with that, and then I'm going to explain the PYRE token, okay? Yeah, thank you. Yes, we are investing in erasers. These were given to us actually, but I'm not going to explain the context there. Okay, multivariable equation. Watts equals amperes times volts. Do you remember this, Javery? From electrical engineering? Who here knows this equation? Amps times volts. Who? All right, Dr. Mack knows it. Yes. Does anyone else know it? Power. Yes. Power equals current times voltage. And voltage, by the way, is a difference in potential. Isn't that weird? So voltage, by the way, is actually is not fixed reference. It's floating reference, right? You have 0 volts, but you know. Anyways, so Dr. Mack, indeed, yes. The ability to understand floating references versus fixed references is literally night and day if you want to understand things like tokenomics and economics. But yes, so when we talk about amps times volts, when we talk about inflation versus deflation, you have things like supply and demand. Does that make sense? And supply and demand, or I guess you could say token A or token B, they both end up affecting like the total amount you need to get the price of something higher. Does that make sense? Because the supply of something going down makes it more scarce, and the demand of something makes it more valuable, right? So like at the same time, it's scarcity along with its demand, right? Like if it's low supply and high demand, both of these things affect its price, but you can also get to the same price. Like if your price equals 100 and your supply equals 1, that means that the demand is equal to 100. Does that make sense? right? Making sense? Like if you have one supply, the demand for it, meaning like, oh, I can't find this thing anywhere. If it literally converts at this price, at this ask, then your price is 100. However, if the supply was 10, as it were, it could also get, and by the way, this price here means the cumulative of the supply, by the way. In this context, at least in this context, means the demand could be as low as 10 to get to 100. Does that make sense? Yes, I ought to pull up supply. And, you know, I think the supply and demand curve, Pega, tends to be a little bit confusing to people, which is unfortunate, but I can draw that if you'd like. I will start with, I'm going to use all the colors this time. Damn it. Okay. So you can actually draw this where either one is supply and which one's demand, but I think right here the red one is demand. Actually, no, the red one's supply. Yeah, look at that. Okay. Supply and demand. And you might notice that there aren't actual animal numbers here. Like there isn't like, this is ordinal math. It's ordinal calculus. It's not cardinal calculus. Do you guys know what ordinal means? Ordinal means without numbers. Does that make sense? Now, the price and the quantity, this is the moment where they kind of like find equilibrium. Q, for the most part, means 1, because you mean like for most times you're looking for like what one of these is. Does that make sense? So like if you're trying to analyze like a commodity like wood or like cheese or like orange juice or coffee, you would think about like one pound of coffee or 1 ton of coffee or 1 pallet of wood or whatever segment you're looking at, maybe 1 2x4. Does that make sense? And the price is going to be determined on the supply versus demand. Now, both of these things, like price can basically go up as demand goes up, but it can also go up with supply going down. So like this part right here is a little bit confusing because supply here is supposed to be like inverse to how demand is written, if that makes sense. And I've realized that I'm using the 2 markers with 2 different colors. But, okay, so demand is low. Here we'll just call it high. I'll just write high so it's easier to understand. Supply is low actually here. And this might not be easy to understand. Because they don't normally label it like this because it can be interpreted in the opposite as well, by the way. But I'm gonna leave it as one fixed way. So it's easier, I think. Okay? So like demand being low, like while supply is high, arguably, like I'm defeating my own work here. Supply being low while demand being high. If you think about these both being forces, they can drive price up per quantity. Does that make sense? Now, supply being low, demand being low while supply being high, this is something almost as if it's a point of tension that would drive price down. Does that make sense? I want you guys to think maybe about like these 4 quadrants more so than the lines. Does that make sense? Do you guys think about the quadrants more so than the lines? That's the way that it's easiest to understand, because I want you guys to understand that supply and demand are like these 2 lines of tension. Does that make sense? They're like lines of tension that effectively, they have slack in them as information gets passed around the market, but it's easier to understand about the way things get pulled based on the combination of supply and demand, because you can never really have a scenario where you don't have both. Does that make sense? So in the quadrant where supply is low and demand is high, this is something that will drive price upwards. Does that make sense? Now in the price where demand is high and supply is high, believe it or not, this will actually increase quantity. Or sorry. That's not even true. Okay. When supply is high and demand is high, it can be argued that more of the quantity is getting moved. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Like for a given price, people are just going to be buying it in larger amounts. Does that make sense? Because the demand is high. Like whether or not like supply is high and demand is high. It doesn't have anything to do with price. Like if price is staying the same, do you guys remember? Okay, do you guys remember in COVID-19? Javery, it's a great way to think of it. Do you guys remember during COVID when a bunch of people just bought toilet paper like in droves? Like they literally just cleared all the shelves of toilet paper in supermarkets and grocery stores. Right? Javery, I didn't do it. I didn't even go to the store that day. But the point being is, demand was high and supply was high. So they literally just bought more. Does that make sense? They were just buying more. Right? Like the price didn't catch up to this until like a toilet paper black market formed. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? But effectively, like the consumption was high. Exactly. I guess you can think of it as volume. Yeah. Because when you talk about volume, you're not talking. But that's a great way to think of it. Like there's going to be a lot of volume at that price, right? Like, as the price isn't changing here. So that's what pulls quantity in that direction. Now, if supply is high and demand is low, that pulls price down. And a great example for this is, I guess you can think of it like, the Venezuelan currency, but that's actually not, I don't want to talk about that. Instead, I want to talk about, I was in the CBD market in maybe 5 years ago. It's hard for me to really think about time now. I was in the CBD industry during its boom, and afterwards its bust. And everything with cannabinoids, CBD in the United States and North America, it was getting infused in everything. It was getting infused in food, in cosmetics, in hygiene products, in health products, in supplements. Don't even get me started. In dog food. And believe it or not, a lot of it was just like this kind of sentimental narrative hype based around the fact that it was like one of the properties of weed that was legal that was now available to the masses. And by the way, CBD does have actual applications. And like I think using it as a muscle relaxant, if you're like injured, is probably one of the best ways. Also as a sleeping aid, if you don't want to think about that. Oh, by the way, I was going to play the game today because I got screwed out of it last time. Yeah, inflammatory as well. But the fact of the matter is that everybody grew it because it was so expensive in the beginning that at a certain point, there was so much of it, there was just so much supply, and literally the demand had dried up because people had realized that maybe a lot of its applications weren't as good as originally sold. Does that make sense? Like there are applications for it, but I think that people were treating it like this will cure your cancer today, type of snake oil type of approach. That I think that like I guess you could say there was consumer exhaustion. Does that make sense? The demand dried up and the supply was super high. So when I entered CBD, the price of a pound of biomass was like $100, and when I got out, it was like 65 cents. So that was like a 99% crash. Anyways, does that make sense? Like for the same quantity, price gets pulled down. Now, if we go back to this, when supply is low and demand is low, it's almost like people are going to be buying it in smaller amounts. I don't even know how a good allegory for this scenario, but like, okay, you could probably think of it as something like, really obscure insurance. Does that make sense? Like volcano insurance, flood insurance. It might also be like, no, I'm talking about here, like supply is low and demand is low. Yeah, zero kicks, maybe collectibles. Does that make sense? But like, remember, like asking price is not the same thing as converting price, right? So if you're interested in weird collectibles, so let's say antiques, right? How about antiques? Does that make sense? Yeah. But there is volcano insurance, by the way, in certain areas. But like, yes, I do know the Family Guy reference. I think maybe antiques or something weird, like it's obscure collectibles, right? They're hard to find. In fact, I think this fucking hourglass is like 100 years old. It's like fully Art Deco, and it's functional, but like, I don't know if you could get more than like a few $dozen for it. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know if you could sell it for more than $50, although it was probably worth. Fuck, man, I can't even speculate on what it would be. Does that make sense? So like, it's also not going to move as fast, right? It's like, well, the antique market sure is slow. Well, crude oil, I would say, has a demand. You know what I mean? Like, it's a liquid market. If you get what I'm saying. I'm sorry, but yeah, I would say that there is an actual usage. Whereas, like this little guy, this little knight, this guy is probably 30 or 40 years old, and yeah, like I'm motivated to sell it at the same rate that somebody would be motivated to buy it. The biggest value add to this knight is that it was the original knight on the PYRESWAP show set. Does that make sense? That doesn't really speak to the fact that it's 40 years old. Do you guys get what I'm saying? You know what I mean? Like, it, arguably, like, nobody cares. You know? Like, oh, okay. It's real metal. I don't know if that matters. But, okay. Pega, that's correct. Yeah, because they're not going to, there's a value to having reserves, but you don't want to have too much reserves. Because, again, there's the idea of time value of money. So you want to have, like, some savings, but you don't want to have too much savings. Anyways, does that make sense on supply and demand? I didn't think I would teach that, but it is a bit counterintuitive at times. But I think the best way to understand it is like understanding it in quadrants, and then understanding that these lines are like points of tension. So if you can imagine, if you were dragging two lines in one area, you would be able to pull this equilibrium of price and quantity in the four directions. Does that make sense? But yeah, Pega, that's correct. Like, they're going to effectively keep price the same. So yeah, when they see supply is low and the demand is low, they're going to create scarcity because they don't want. Because what Pega is saying, by the way, is they're not going to make the supply oversupply because that will bring prices down. So they are in fact defending the price by reducing production. Pega, I didn't understand what you were saying, but yeah, that actually is a good example. I think what you described is a little bit advanced because we're talking about like whether or not one quadrant or the other quadrant would happen. That might be a discussion for another day. But like, yeah, that is a way that price and quantity can shift, because they can either think about like, okay, if demand is going down, we can either protect the price or we can protect the quantity. That's basically what their choices are. Like, do they want to err on price or on price on quantity? Oh, that makes sense. Okay. As far as like post-Genesis incentives for liquidity, okay, for those of you who don't know, liquidity pairs already get swap fees. Now, this is not really well understood, but there is a dashboard in phase 2 called Professor Phi's liquidity dashboard. This dashboard is very, very important because it is going to really examine a lot more variables that are inside liquidity instruments, the LP token itself. And there's something that it specifically manages or looks at, measures, and it's called DLPM as its category name. DLPM, which stands for Dynamic Locus Point Metricity. Dynamic locus point metricity. That's really easy to understand, right? I know it's not. I'm going to explain it in a second. Hang on. Okay, we got 4 minutes. I'm sorry. This is Y. This is X. And this is K. Are you guys familiar with what you're seeing on the screen? Who here knows what I'm talking about? I think it's a pretty good hyperbola for just freehand. What do you guys think? Do you guys know what this is? As it refers to liquidity, as it corresponds? This is the constant product formula drawn in graph form. X, Y equals K. Making sense? Okay. Now what I want you guys to understand though is when we talk about X, this is the same equation as watts, right? What was the thing we looked at before? Amps times volts equals watts. Did you guys know this? Does anybody know why if you plug a laptop computer into a car that it'll fucking overheat, possibly catch on fire and burn itself? Do you guys know why? Damn it. Okay, I gotta play now. This is, by the way, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Javery, can you explain? Too much volts is actually too much amps, sir. Okay, let's see. Going to stake. Here, I'm gonna use my stool. I gotta get locked in for this. Okay. Okay, I have some. All right. I'm just going to get this going. And unfortunately, I have to get to the point where I can see my timer and my MetaMask on screen at the same time. So we'll just make this happen. Yep. Trigger, thank you so much for that warning. Trigger is front running the PYREBot on the announcement on the Ultimate Minute. Bravo. That's called being on top of things. Yep. Okay. Yep. We got 43 seconds. I'm locked in. I'm not missing it this time. Yeah. Amps times volts equals watts. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, and I don't want to, I'm going to screw this up. In the United States, 120 volts equals houses, and 12 volts equals cars. Does that make sense to you guys? Did you guys know that the voltage in cars is 10 times lower than they are in houses or buildings? Were you guys aware of this? All right, confirming. Come on, MetaMask, don't let me down. Stake. Let's see, am I in? Okay, I'm in. I'm in. Fuck yeah. Fuck yeah. Never felt so alive. Holy shit, my heart is beating a mile a minute. Okay, claim. Go! I mean, technically speaking, with the usurping guard, you don't need to really panic, with the exception that maybe, I don't know. Honestly, I can't wait till we get back to the taking the usurping guard off. Just in my opinion. Yeah, we'll need to scale the user base up for that. Anyways, fantastic. Looks like I'm up, boys. Looks like I'm up. I was at 265, 266 now. Yeah. How does it happen? How does it happen? Okay, back to professor work. For those of you watching this video, as it gets edited into a clip about demonstrating the inclination which will hold. If your heart is beating a mile a minute, that's normal. Yeah, you just work through that. No matter the amount of money you're playing for. Okay? Alright, anyways. So the fact of the matter is, if your laptop has a draw of like, I don't even know what it draws. Like, let's say like 50 watts, or let's say 120 watts. Does that make sense? Let's say it's 120 watts. If it's 120 watts, then how much amps are you going to have in your laptop when you're plugged into the house? 10. Actually 1. Yeah, JB, 1. Yeah, because it's 120 to 120. Yes, this would be 1 amp. Yes. But if we were in the car, what would our amperage be? Oh, did I? Okay. I wanted to plug it in the house first. Yes. Okay. If we're plugging it into the house and the laptop is 120 watts, then it's going to draw 1 amp. Does that make sense? Because 120 watts divided by 120 volts equals 1. Would you guys agree that 120 over 120 over 120 equals 1? Does everybody follow me there? Yeah. Now, in a car, you're going to have 120 over 12. What's 120 over 12, you guys? Correct. 10. It's 10. Now, for those of you who don't know, that means that if you're plugging a laptop into a car, you're drawing 10 times the amount of current to get to the same power. Now, you might be wondering, why the fuck does that cause it to set on fire? Believe it or not, there is something about copper that causes electricity when it runs through it to emit heat. And this reaction is known as copper loss, also known as I squared R loss. Does that make sense? I squared R loss? Current generates heat, yes. In fact, Javery, current generates heat exponentially. Because I, in this equation, is actually a symbol for current. So the fact of the matter is, your laptop, when it's plugged into the car, is not necessarily 10 times hotter than it is in the house. It might be 100 times hotter than it is at the house. Does that make sense to everybody? Correct, Pega, yes. Correct. You guys nailed it, yep. It might be 100 times hotter in the house, and if it's 100 times hotter, that's why it starts melting and or setting on fire when laptops get plugged in the cars. If you don't use a converter. Does that make sense? Making sense? Anyways. The reason why I think I intuitively understand... Oh yeah, by the way, do you guys know that washing machines and drying machines use higher voltage? They use 240 volts. Do you know why? So they don't catch fire. Were you guys aware of that? If your washing dryer was on 120 volts, yes, exactly. If it was on 120 volts, it would be catching fire. Did you guys know this? Yeah. This is why they use 240 volts. And now you know. Yes, dryer fires happen at 120 volts. Just point that out. Anyways, xy equals k, and we're going to eliminate this parallel of A times v equals w. Although, that's the same relationship. Does that make sense? The wattage you have to hit is a locus point. So first of all, this red line here, which I'm labeling k, do you guys know what this is called in the anatomy of a hyperbola? Pega, that's exactly correct. Pega, that's exactly correct. You are describing the problem in another way. It's the exact same situation though. this red line, I'm going to actually label it in a different color here. Hang on. It's called the locus. It's called the locus of the hyperbola. And by the locus, it means all possible points where it can be located. Does that make sense? All possible points. Remember, dynamic locus point metricity. The locus is all possible points, but then you also have an actual point, which I'll label as, like, let's say right here. I'll label it here. This right here is the point, also known as the locus point. Does that make sense? And do you guys know what this is when we talk about liquidity? Like, what does this point mean? Good that you have a converter, by the way. In any given amount of liquidity, this point represents the X quantity, token X, versus token Y. Does that make sense? 0x, it doesn't represent necessarily a swap, although you can if you want to. Think about like a swap here, but swaps are actually what move the point. Does that make sense? So every time a swap happens, every time a swap happens, the point moves. Did you guys know this? But yeah, 0x, do you understand what I'm saying? The swaps move the point in both directions, either direction. Okay, just so 0x understands. But the point is actually the current price. Does that make sense? Because you have token X versus token Y. Let's say that this is BNB against Ethereum or something like that. Does that make sense? So you have more of token X. So token X is BNB. We'll say this is BNB. And token Y is like Ethereum. So right now, BNB is what, like 500 bucks? We'll say it's 500 bucks. And Ethereum is what, like 3,000? I don't even fucking know. Like, I literally, like, yeah, I'll pull up CoinMarketCap. Okay, 2,500 bucks and about 548. Okay, we're just gonna use 500 and 2,500 for easy. Does that make sense? So right here, you could say that this equals, let's actually use a different color again. Let's use green. So just like on supply and demand, we're looking for these two values. So for X, this could equal 5, and Y, this could equal 1. And when we talk about looking at BNB versus Ethereum right now, they trade at about 5 to 1. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Okay, so this point right here, it's more, when you actually have liquidity deployed, it's more than just the ratio. Because I want you guys to understand something. 0x. When you swap, this point moves. This point moves up and down the locus. It moves up and down the locus. Does that make sense? It can go infinite in that direction and go infinite in this direction. Rarely do you see it go infinitely, because if it does, that probably means a rug pull happened or some other type of disaster. Does that make sense? Generally speaking, there are points on this where like the gas price is too high for it to go any further. Do you guys get what I'm saying? Right, so in theory, it can go theoretically infinitely down this line, down the locus, and it can go theoretically infinitely up the locus. Does that make sense? So like Javery is saying, it's always moving to balance the ratio between the two tokens. So when we say it's always moves, Javery, we are calling that dynamic. We are calling this a dynamic locus point. Does that make sense? This locus is where all the possible places of the point. The point is where it is now. As the point moves up and down, it is dynamic. Does that make sense? It is not a fixed point. It is a point that responds to changes. And this point is the ratio of the underlying tokens in the instrument on this curve. Making sense? Dynamic locus point metricity. Metricity is all the things that we care about pertaining to this point. All the things we care about. Now, what might that be? Because, do you know the size of the point? Do you guys know what the size of the point is? Because the size of the point is different on different dexes. No, Jabri, the size of the point is the size of the swap fee. Because the swap fee is collected in both X and Y. Does that make sense? Did you guys know that? So, oh, indeed, like a float, yeah. Like it's a small nano margin. Does that make sense? Because, Jabri, why do we care about this? You were asking about whether or not there's incentives for liquidity deployment past Genesis. The answer is yes. When you have a dashboard that is telling you what's happening to your dynamic locus point. Because right now, Jabri, your liquidity is also earning fees on top of emissions. Does that make sense? Like you're getting emissions in Pyre Phantom, Pyre AVAX, whatever, but it's also making you more of BNB and Ethereum. Does that make sense? Because as BNB and Ethereum moves around, the dynamic locus point, the K value of this point is increasing. Does that make sense? As long as nobody's withdrawing or deploying new liquidity, the K value of this point keeps increasing. Does that make sense? And as the K value is increasing, that therefore implies the two underlying tokens must be increasing as well. Does that make sense? So if we're on PYRESWAP, and let's say you have a 0.7 swap fee, which by the way, we will have lower swap fees in phase 2. But let's say you have a 0.7 swap fee, you could describe it that, let's say that there's a certain amount of liquidity on the DEX. Let's say there's like $10,000, and let's say $1,000 is yours. So the dynamic locus point for the whole liquidity position is 0.7% of 10,000. So if you took like 0.7 of 5,000 of one, right? So let's say we have Ethereum at $2,500, right? So if we took 0.7% of 2 Ethereum, right? And then we took 0.7% of 10 BNB. Does that make sense to you guys? And you're basically going to end up with 0.35 and 0.35 of both. Literally, Jabri, that all depends on the metricity. So, like, again, yeah, that depends on, like, what's going on with that pair. Yeah, so, like, yeah, like, I mean, you're talking about, like, if you talk about Bitcoin against Ethereum, maybe, but they also move in such parallel that the good news is you never get IL. The bad news is like you almost never get swap fees. Does that make sense? So like it's a very safe one. Correct. That like it depends on the token, Jabri. Yeah, what tokens are we talking about? Does that make sense? Yeah. Like in theory, like if you were gonna be Did you read the stuff in the documentation, Jabri, about vibratility? Okay, vibratile liquidity pairs is one of the secret value adds of PYRESWAP. And by vibratile liquidity pairs, I mean holding 2 tokens in liquidity that are vibratile with each other. The reason being is that they don't diverge enough that you would have cross lambda loss, but they also diverge enough to make sure that you're getting lots of fees. The fact of the matter is their divergence and convergence are incentivized by token utilities. I hope that makes sense. Because you want to have kind of like a distant orbit and a close orbit. You want to have like a perihelion and an aphelion. Aphelion? Hope that makes sense. Aphelion? Perihelion? Anyways, inside your dynamic locus point metricity, you want to know about the quantity change of token X. You want to know about the quantity change of token Y. You want to know about the price change of token X. And you want to know the price change of token Y. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that I have written in dynamic locus point metricity, but I'm not going to talk about it now because, it's just not as pertinent as stuff more close into the present. Correct, Jabri, correct. And again, That's why I just keep beating the same drum again and again and again. Yeah, scaling the user base remains the number one goal. And yeah, it's the type of thing that solves all the problems at this point. Yeah. We're going to make it. I don't know what to say. Yeah, we're all going to make it. I hope that a lot of you understand what might seem like sorcery to you guys is a parlor trick to me. Okay? Like, we hyperinflated for a month. Like, I was aware of this the whole time. I look at something called Professor Fine's Elastic Supply Dashboard because the most likely way you're gonna know what the chart is gonna do tomorrow is by looking at what the dashboard tells you today. Does that make sense? With the exception of like upsets, like volatility, with the exception of like volatility moments where arguably it's kind of like a market upset happened, majority of the time, I would say 80%, that dashboard can kind of tell you a lot about the expectation of the price chart tomorrow. Does that make sense? Because generally I think that the price chart of today is the quantity chart of yesterday. But what do I know? Anyways, that's an example of something in phase 2. This is really important because there's another thing that people don't understand, and I'm going to talk about this in brief. Okay, today I'm going to talk about quotient volume versus product volume. So if you thought volume was hard enough to understand before, I'm going to tell you that there's actually 2 different forms of it in DeFi. You guys aware of this? Quotient volume and product volume. By the way, these are my words. I named them this. I named them this to help you guys understand. Okay? Why do I call them quotient volume and product volume? I'm going to tell you. Product volume quotient volume thank you, Jabri. Product volume, you're measuring it in K. Does that make sense? And quotient volume, you're measuring it in Y. Now, do you guys understand this? So quotient volume, you're literally looking at Y or X, or literally, this equation can also be reversed, by the way, so I should just write that too. Yeah, I'll also write X equals K over Y. And we're also looking at X in this context. Does that make sense? Literally, the difference between quotient volume and product volume is how you arrange the equation. Is everyone follow me here? Quotient volume refers to X or Y in one of these equations. Product volume is you're looking at K. Everybody follow me still? Okay, so let's say I go to Dex Screener. Now, for those of you who have been with this project for several months, Pega, maybe you remember this. Do you remember when sometimes on the BNB side of the Dex, there would be an arbitrage bot that would stampede through like a really obscure pair, like, I don't know, like D-share against something, or I don't even know. It would be like a $5 liquidity pair, and it would look like it ran 2 $1,000 transactions. Has anybody ever seen this before? Is Zonic on here today? Okay, you've seen that before, right? So when Dex Screener looks at that, they are showing you quotient volume. Does that make sense? So if you look today, let's say we're looking at Solana, and we look at this top token called Solex, and let's actually look at a DEX and not a coin. Let's look at Radium. So Radium has 606 million dollars in volume today. Now, do you guys what volume is that? What type of volume do you guys think that is? Zero clicks, exactly, and that's why you're actually jumping ahead of the class, Zero clicks. Okay, when Dex Screener shows you a volume, do you guys think they're showing you quotient volume or product volume? They're showing you quotient volume. I'll just tell you. They're showing you quotient volume. Because, first of all, product volume can't really be expressed in dollars accurately. Yeah, quotient volume, Pega, yeah. Think of it this way. If you have $1,000 of a buy and then $1,000 of a sell, $1,000 buy on one pair and then $1,000 sell, they ring this in as $2,000 of volume. Does that make sense? And by the way, they're not inaccurate. They're just talking about quotient volume. Does that make sense? So literally, if you look at this token right here, it's sicko mode. Sicko mode. It's a token right there, number 3, sicko mode. So if you look at this chart settings, let's look at the chart. And let's say we zoomed in to like right here, and you guys can see that certain green candles are here and certain red candles are here, right? So they brought the price up and they brought the price down. Does that make sense? So if you guys can see my mouse, my big purple mouse, right here at the bottom of this green candle and right here at the middle of this red candle, Javery, no. It's like, compared to product volume, no. Because like quotient volume, yes, but like that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah, that's not what we're talking about here. I want you guys to understand that as the price went up from green candles and then went back from red candles, it recorded all that volume like cumulatively. So Javery, yes, it's like cumulative volume. Does that make sense? But I want to be clear the difference between quotient volume and product volume. Because in product volume, okay, do you guys know why we care about product volume? Yeah. Like, yes, total, not net. Right, cumulative. Yeah, like absolute value. Let's put it that way, Javery. It's like an absolute value. Like absolute value volume. But that's also not it. So I don't want to call it absolute value volume. I want to call it quotient volume, if you'll still bear with me. Does that make sense? Okay. The fact of the matter is, if you guys can see on this chart where money went in and then it came back out, now it still got volume the whole time. But the fact of the matter is, your swap fees, the person who's deploying liquidity, swap fees are not calculated or not accumulated in quotient volume, at least not with the UniV2 infrastructure. They're accumulated in product volume. Zero Kex, I think you're, yeah. And the fact of the matter is, product volume can't really be expressed in dollar signs unless you're just thinking of it as like the dollar at the time of what? Does that make sense? Because you can't divorce product volume from time value. So what I mean by that, it's more like the total amount of liquidity growth based on the volume. Like that's basically the way I can describe it. Yeah. So if you guys understand, as the swap fees accumulate swap fees, they're accumulating quantities of both tokens. Does that make sense? So over time, the product, the K line, is in fact getting larger, but the underlying tokens might be going up and down with respect to each other. You're always having a consecutive increase in K, but X and Y can fluctuate. Does that really make sense? The K growth is the long-term growth. Does that make sense? X and Y are like short-term variables. Making sense? Okay. So, for instance, when I think on the first day, no, Pega, it's okay, Pega. Product volume is used in swap fees. So the incants that we the incants that are delivered to the incantation, they are derived from product volume. Does that make sense? Because they are in the form of K first, then they are withdrawn from K. Does that make sense? They're withdrawn from K every 6 hours. So if we have, let's say if we have like $1,000 of buy pressure plus $1,000 of sell pressure, you'll still get fees, but the fees will literally be proportional to X going up, let's say, I don't know, 100%, and then going down like 99.3%. Jeffrey, mostly correct, yes. It is that is true. That is true overall. But the fact of the matter is that what I'm saying is that it's not proportional to quotient volume. It's proportional to product volume. So the incant package is proportional to product volume and not proportional to quotient volume. Because if $1,000 gets bought and $1,000 gets sold, that doesn't mean that we have 7% of this would be $70, right? And then that does not become $140 of incants. Does that make sense? I guess so, Zero Kex. Yeah. But I'm gonna keep calling it this. If you're coming up with your own words, I have no idea. But these are the words I'm gonna use because I think they get to the fucking point. Because this, we're referring to it as a division problem. Here's a multiplication problem. If you guys remember this from elementary school, quotient is the answer to a division problem. Product is the answer to a multiplication problem. Do you guys remember that? Is everybody on the same page? Does that make sense officially? Right? Product meaning multiplication problem. Quotient meaning it's a division problem. Does that make sense? In general, more volume means more incants. However, it's just not proportional to quotient volume, which is what Dex Screener shows you. The reason Dex Screener shows you quotient volume is because you can easily measure it in fucking dollars. Does that make sense? It's like they just ring in the dollar value of the transaction based on the time. Does that make sense? Dollar, and they just like stockpile it up, and then first of all, they can probably make it look more interesting as well. Does that make sense? You can get a higher number with quotient volume than you can with product volume. Making sense? Okay. This is not a bad thing. Nothing I'm describing is a bad thing. I'm just describing something that is, it's a gap in comprehension for a lot of people concerning dexes. Does that make sense? And volume in general on dexes, especially with the XY equals K formula. So, by the way, this is new Fithianism, quotient volume and product volume. That's official Fithianism, debuted today. I have never debuted that to the public before. So yes, there is in fact two different ways of determining volume. As far as like a metric, as far as like a unit for product volume, I think you have to just measure it in like token X over token Y. Like I literally think you would have to, you would have to measure it like based on you would have to come up with an equation that doesn't really afford for just reducing everything to a dollar. Does that make sense? It would be like two numbers with a fucking, probably two numbers with a vinculum, with a ratio. Does that make sense? So the product volume would probably have to be demonstrated as a ratio, meaning this amount of token X went through and this amount of token Y went through. And we don't even care about the price. Does that make sense? Do you guys get what I'm saying? Like you wouldn't even look at the dollar value. I think you would just look at 1000X to like 10Y. Do you get what I'm saying? So I think product volume, and I'll write this out, I think this would be like, 7 against 17 or some shit like that. You would display it as a ratio or something like that. Or actually, you would probably display it as a ratio less than 1. Actually, no, it could be higher than 1 too, because the other way. Yeah, so it would just be a ratio, probably like, probably like 0.8, 0.85. Let's make it 0.85 or something like that. And you would just, I actually don't even like that either because it's not clear which one is the X and which one is the Y. But arguably on Dex Screener they can make it look this way. I think it's kind of like TWAP, but it's not TWAP because you're looking at volume. Does that make sense? So the way that TWAP, which by the way, you guys know how to see that on the DEX, right? If you look over here and you measure it against Sol, right? You can see that the price is 0.050 and then 2907. So it's that ratio of Sol. Does that make sense? So instead of it being a price delivered as a ratio, you would look at it as a volume as a ratio. I haven't like literally turned this into an entire formal treatise yet. This is not in PDF form anywhere. It is in notebooks. Notebooks and now whiteboards. But yeah, so I hope that helps explain some things. I'm going to also explain a little bit about things we're going to do to PYRESWAP in phase 2 concerning swap fees now that you guys understand quotient volume and product volume. So believe it or not, as you guys are aware, quotient volume has the ability to look larger than product volume. Would you guys agree? Pega, I live to, this is the service I provide for the world. Okay? What if you could collect swap fees? Oh, by the way, do you guys know why concentrated liquidity gets more swap fees? Do you guys know now? It's not even that. No, I just explained it. I just explained it. By the way, this is not unique to concentrated liquidity, meaning it's not like the bin system, but I mean, DEXs like Trader Joe, their concentrated liquidity, when you get fees, do they give it to you in the product or do they give it to you in the quotient? I understand they give it to you in both of the underlying tokens. Does that make sense? So because you're collecting the swap fee in quotient and not product, the fees look like they're higher. Does everybody follow me? Okay, are you guys following me? Okay, so in phase 2, we're still going to have constant product formula, but swap fees will be collected in the input token quotient volume. Making sense? So, incantations will be cheaper to create because we don't need to break them out of LP, and they will also be larger because they will be made out of quotient volume and not product volume. Naturally, they'll still also, by the way, it'll actually be combo because the version of the DEX now will still be giving it in fucking in product volume. Does that make sense? So it'll be a combo of Q volume and P volume. And I don't want to call them Q volume and P volume because if you remember from earlier today, quantity and price are also Q and P. So I'm going to keep calling them quotient volume and P volume, and I might, and I can't even do QU and PR. I think it would be like quat vol and prod vol. I think this is the maximum abbreviation that I can accept. Quat vol and prod vol. No, well, okay, Javery, do you remember on the supply and demand chart there was quantity and price? Remember the Q and P from the chart before, the diagram? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, granted, there's multiple versions for T, right? For those of you who are big fans of mine, you know that TU and TE, and here the letter T stands for two different things. Here it stands for transpiration, and here it stands for terminal, right? Do you guys know what the U and E stand for? Anyways. Point being, correct, Avery. Terminal utility and transpiration epoch. Transpire epoch, whatever. Believe it or not, in finance, by the way, there's volume and there's also volatility. Did you guys know that? So even vol here is not like clear. Because like, is it volume or is it volatility? Because volatility is a whole nother thing, which is, by the way, displayed by a Greek symbol called vega, which I put a bit of an extra long hat there. But yeah, vega is the symbol for volatility. Anyways, so the point being is that the amount of tokens, yeah, the amount of tokens that are going to be sent to the incantation. Yeah, exactly, Pega. Yeah, liquidity provider, liquidity pool. Yeah, you're 100% correct. Yeah, it is confusing there as well. By the way, I will debut this as well. So in phase 2, there's also going to be a conceptual debut as well, and it's called the Yibli. Y-B-L-I, and that's pronounced. Okay, I'm sorry. Yibli. Y-B-L-I. Yibli. I'm going to call it a Yibli. I'm not going to talk about Yiblis like ever again. Okay? Not until phase 2 for sure. Yibli stands for Yield Bearing Liquidity Instrument. And this is an acronym used to kind of expand the financial concept around an LP token as an investment vehicle in a financial instrument. And a lot of the stuff that's in Uniswap v2 doesn't do a good job for this, which is why we have to kind of reconfigure the factory. We're going to have to create like a different factory. One, this factory accepts fees in quotient volume, not product volume. 2, it doesn't have a sync. 3, its nomenclature for LP has changed. 4, it updates LP token quantities on swaps, not on withdraws and deploys. And there's like a few more things that I can't remember right now. Anyways, no big deal about that. Anyways, I hope you guys had a good show today. I feel like we're making a comeback here. And more on this later. Oh, guys, we now have a Turkish Twitter. Okay, let me debut this. We just threw this account together. It is at PYRESWAP TR. It's not even really like going yet, but it now exists. Thank you, Pega. Yes. And by the way, this is what I would like to do all the time. And I think in order to do this all the time, I need a bigger user base. 5 needs a bigger fan base, or PYRESWAP needs a bigger user base, and it's just like the same problem keeps showing up. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying that, Pega. If you guys could follow PYRESWAP TR on Twitter just to give it a few seedling followers. It's going to be mostly in Turkish, but yeah, if you could follow it just for support, that would be great. PYRESWAP TR. Oh, by the way, I have a Vegeta shirt on today. Javery, okay guys, can I also tell you guys something? I have a shirt, I got it recently, and it does say, does that make sense on the shirt, okay? I don't know when I'm gonna debut it, but maybe I'll debut it when we're clearly in an uptrend, and I'm gonna flex on everybody. I'm gonna just wear that shirt, and I'm gonna point to it like this. I'm gonna be so fucking cocky, and yeah, that's when you guys will see that shirt debut. And if you could follow PYRESWAP TR, by the way, guys, AVAX Talk is today. AVAX Talk is today. This might be our last sponsored show. We might pick it up again in like October, but I think today is our last sponsored show for like a month or so. You know, Javery, to me, that's all the same. That's all the same. And by the way, I'm cocky and bullish even when nobody else is. Yeah, and I think, again, like I said, what is sorcery to a lot of people is a parlor trick to me, okay? Like, I want you to understand that, like, the chart looking like it's down 99% is still not that fucking bad. If you understand that the Senorage Circus made its name from resurrecting projects from the dead. Does that make sense? So if you're a 2022 era 5 fan, you understand that, like, this is not something that even makes my I know that some people are losing their fucking mind, but, like, again, you just make deflation higher than inflation. Yes, Pega. PYRESWAP TR. That is the Turkish PYRESWAP Twitter account. Thank you, Pyre Producer. If you guys could follow this on Twitter, just so it has like a few like early followers, we'll be retweeting and stuff from the main account a few times here and there. And not found. Okay, you know what, Pega? It might be too young. Is it? Oh. Pega, it might be shadow banned. I don't know because it's too young. Can anybody else see it? Okay, there it is. Yeah. Okay, Pega, it might just be like sometimes I can't find John McAfee's account. Do you guys know what I mean? Like it's shadow banned. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Right? Like it's just not there. So there's Zero Kex has linked it. Thank you, Zero Kex. And my throat is a little sore, but I think I'll be able to make AVAX Talk happen. So I would appreciate if you guys come and support me on AVAX Talk. That will be in about 2 hours. 2 hours and 20 minutes, AVAX Talk. Okay, guys. Thank you so much for coming to the PYRESWAP show. Did I have more to talk about today? Nah, not really. Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.